Welcome to G Fun Facts Online. Imagine walking through a bustling marketplace in the ancient Mediterranean during the late 3rd century AD. The air is thick with the smell of spices, roasting meats, and the sweat of frustrated merchants. Citizens are furiously haggling over the price of grain, olive oil, and basic clothing. But there is a palpable sense of panic. The coins in the hands of the buyers are practically worthless, their silver content having been stripped away by decades of imperial manipulation. Prices are doubling, then tripling, wiping out the savings of ordinary families and making it impossible for the Roman state to afford its own massive legions. It is against this backdrop of runaway hyperinflation and societal exhaustion that Emperor Diocletian unleashed one of the most audacious and comprehensive economic experiments in human history, the Edict on Maximum Prices, or Edictum de Pretis Rerum Venalium of 301 AD. Carved into stone and erected across the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the edict sought to conquer the invisible forces of supply and demand through the sheer willpower of imperial decree. Today, the most spectacular and well-preserved remnants of this colossal legislative effort survive in the ancient city of Aphrodisias in modern-day Turkey. Through the monumental inscriptions found on the facade of the city's civil basilica, historians and economists have been able to decode the Roman Empire's desperate strategies to control an economy in freefall. To understand the sheer scale of Diocletian's intervention, one must first understand the devastating era that preceded it, an era known as the crisis of the 3rd century. For over 50 years, the Roman Empire was fractured by endless civil wars, devastating plagues, and invasions from all frontiers. Between 235 and 284 AD, dozens of emperors and usurpers claimed the throne, most of them meeting violent ends. Warfare is an incredibly expensive endeavor. Because the emperors could not simply print paper money to fund their legions, they resorted to an insidious method of expanding the money supply known as currency debasement. Beginning as far back as the reign of Nero and accelerating wildly under his successors, the Roman state began calling in the standard silver coin, the denarius, and reminting it with cheaper alloys like copper and bronze. By the time Diocletian came to power in 284 AD, the currency had been reduced to a silver-washed shadow of its former glory, containing less than a fraction of its original precious metal. The result was classic hyperinflation. As the intrinsic value of the currency plummeted, citizens hoarded older, purer coins, and merchants demanded exponentially more of the new, debased coins for the exact same goods. The state found itself trapped in a vicious cycle. The more they debased the currency to pay the army, the more prices skyrocketed, forcing them to mint even more debased coinage just to keep up. When Diocletian ascended to the throne, he was determined to restore order to a fractured world. He reorganized the empire into a tetrarchy, a rule of 4, vastly expanded the civil bureaucracy, and restructured the military and provincial administrations. He also established a systematic tax system based on land and population. However, taxation alone could not fix a fundamentally broken monetary system. Diocletian decided to overhaul the currency itself. He introduced a new tri-metallic coinage system. This included the aureus or solidus, struck in pure gold at 60 to a pound. There was also the argentius, a nearly pure silver coin struck at 96 to a pound. Finally, there was the nummus or fullis, a large copper coin with a tiny wash of silver. The problem with this grand monetary illusion was that the state was minting these coins at a massive loss, their face value being lower than the intrinsic market value of the precious metals they contained. To sustain this, the government essentially requisitioned precious metals from citizens at artificial state-mandated exchange rates. By the autumn of 301 AD, the system was failing entirely, and inflation was surging once again. In a desperate attempt to protect the value of his new currency, Diocletian issued a currency edict, re-tariffing the value of the coins and doubling the face value of the common nummus. Rather than stabilizing the economy, this sudden revaluation only poured gasoline on the inflationary fire. Realizing that monetary manipulation was failing to curb the rising costs, Diocletian decided to tackle the prices directly. Between November 20th and December 10th, 301 AD, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices. This was not a subtle fiscal adjustment. It was a heavy-handed, empire-wide command that set hard price ceilings on over 1,200 individual goods, services, and wages. The edict was prefaced by a long, highly rhetorical, and deeply moralizing preamble. In this introduction, Diocletian and his co-emperors entirely absolved the state of any responsibility for the inflation caused by their own centuries of currency debasement. Instead, they placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of merchants, traders, and speculators. The preamble thundered against the limitless and furious avarice, which, with no thought for mankind, hastens to its own gain. Diocletian framed his intervention as a righteous act of justice, designed to protect the common citizens and the soldiers of the Roman legions from greedy profiteers. To ensure compliance, the edict was backed by the ultimate threat. Anyone caught selling goods above the maximum price, or even a consumer caught willingly paying an inflated price, could face the death penalty. Informers were actively encouraged to report their neighbors to the authorities. Such an unprecedented law had to be communicated to millions of citizens across a vast, predominantly illiterate empire. The edict was inscribed onto massive stone slabs and erected in public squares, basilicas, and marketplaces in both Latin and Greek. While fragments of the edict have been discovered as far away as Agira in the Peloponnese, no site on earth has preserved the text of Diocletian's desperate gamble, quite like the ancient city of Aphrodisias. Located in Caria in western Anatolia, Aphrodisias was a thriving center of art, sculpture, and civic life. Here, the edict was carved into the expansive marble paneling along the elaborate columnar facade of the city's civil basilica. Discovered over decades of meticulous archaeological excavation, championed by legendary scholars such as Keenan Aram and Joyce Reynolds, and more recently by Michael Crawford, the Aphrodisias inscription stands as the longest surviving Latin inscription from the ancient world. The sheer physical scale of the Aphrodisias text is awe-inspiring. It stretches for well over 1,000 lines, meticulously listing out commodities in tabular form. In recent years, the Aphrodisias excavation project, sponsored by institutions like Oxford and NYU, has gone to great lengths to preserve and display this crucial economic artifact. In 2023, the remaining parts of the Edict of Maximum Prices were set up on 10 custom-designed metal mounts along the line of the basilica's west wall, accompanied by Turkish and English translations. This allows modern visitors to stand face-to-face with the ancient world's most aggressive price control legislation. Thanks to the exhaustive lists preserved on these stones, modern historians and economists are granted an unparalleled, granular snapshot of daily economic life in late antiquity. The 1,200-plus items read like an ancient catalog, revealing exactly what the Romans valued, what they consumed, and what they deemed luxurious. The listed price ceilings offer a fascinating study in economic contrasts. Let us look at basic foodstuffs first. A measure of crushed beans was capped at 100 denarii communes, while uncrushed beans were 60 denarii. A measure of dried kidney beans also cost 100 denarii. When it came to animal upkeep, a simple bundle of fresh green animal fodder cost a mere 1 denarius, making it one of the absolute cheapest items on the entire list. The edict also strictly regulated what laborers could earn, detailing wages and labor across various professions. A farm worker's daily wage was firmly capped, while specialized services had their own precise metrics. A veterinary surgeon, for example, could legally charge 6 denarii for clipping an animal's hooves, or 20 denarii for bleeding an animal's head. The intellectual class was not spared from these controls. A writer or scribe was paid based on output, allowed to charge 25 denarii per 100 lines for the best writing, and 20 denarii for second-quality writing. Then there were clothing and textiles. Unlike the modern era, where mass production has made clothing relatively cheap, textiles in the ancient world were exorbitantly expensive. Every single thread had to be spun by hand using a drop spindle before being painstakingly woven on a loom. Consequently, fine cloaks and garments cost vast sums of money compared to basic sustenance. Finally, at the very top of the pricing spectrum were the extreme luxuries of the imperial elite. If you wished to purchase a first-class male lion for the arena, the maximum legal price was capped at a staggering 150,000 denarii. Similarly, a single pound of pure purple-dyed silk, which was the ultimate status symbol of the Roman upper class, was also set at 150,000 denarii. Despite the terrifying threat of the death penalty backing these numbers, the Edict on Maximum Prices was a spectacular, almost immediate failure. By trying to override the natural laws of economics with imperial decree, Diocletian created a profound catastrophe. The primary flaw of the edict was its complete ignorance of supply and demand. Diocletian imposed a blanket empire-wide price list that completely ignored regional variations. It failed to account for local crop failures, the varying availability of goods, or the massive costs associated with overland and maritime transportation in the ancient world. For a merchant to transport grain from a highly fertile region to a famine-struck region, the transportation costs alone often exceeded the maximum legal price the grain could be sold for upon arrival. As a result, merchants faced a stark and brutal choice. They could sell their goods at a massive loss, or they could refuse to sell them at all. Unsurprisingly, they chose the latter. Goods were systematically hoarded and immediately disappeared from the public markets. A massive underground black market sprang into existence practically overnight, where goods were traded secretly at their true, inflated market values. Furthermore, because the newly minted currency was so thoroughly distrusted by the populace, citizens began to abandon coinage altogether, plunging massive parts of the highly sophisticated Roman economy back into a primitive system of direct barter. We do not have to rely solely on modern economic theory to know exactly how this disaster played out. We have the vivid eyewitness testimony of the ancient Christian writer Lactantius. Living in the imperial capital of Nicomedia at the time, Lactantius recorded the devastating human toll of Diocletian's policy. He wrote that the emperor's meddling caused a prodigious scarcity, noting grimly that much blood was shed for trifling and paltry wares. Lactantius observed that, out of sheer terror of the death penalty, merchants closed down their stalls entirely, and nothing appeared in the market, which naturally made the societal scarcity much worse than before the edict was issued. Today, the Edict on Maximum Prices is generally recognized by historians as an act of sheer economic lunacy. Within just a few short years of its implementation, the law proved so utterly unenforceable and destructive that it was quietly ignored by imperial magistrates across the empire. By the time Diocletian abdicated his throne due to illness in 305 AD, the edict was functionally dead, and the Roman economy only truly began to stabilize decades later under the gold solidus reforms of Constantine the Great. Yet, the legacy of Diocletian's edict endures as one of history's most profound cautionary tales. It remains a foundational case study for modern economists, demonstrating the inherent dangers of broad price controls. The political rhetoric of Diocletian, blaming corporate greed, speculators, and price gougers for inflation rather than acknowledging state monetary policy, has echoed loudly through the centuries. From Richard Nixon's 90-day freeze on wages and prices in the United States during the stagflation of the 1970s, to modern political debates surrounding rent control and anti-gouging laws, governments continually flirt with the seductive idea that they can simply legislate away the harsh realities of supply and demand. Today, as one stands before the grand civil basilica of Aphrodisias, looking up at the meticulously carved Latin letters detailing the legal price of beans, lions, and the wages of school teachers, the ancient stones speak of a universal truth. They are a monument not just to the astonishing administrative reach of the Roman Empire, but to the absolute limits of state power. Diocletian was a man who commanded armies that conquered continents, yet even he, armed with the ultimate threat of death, could not command the price of a single loaf of bread. Thank you for tuning in to G Fun Facts Online.